Hello and welcome to Jim and Ben's Movie Adventures. My name is Ben and with me as always is...
Jim, the
And are
bug.
you ready to do your part?
I'm ready to do my part. That we
What
did.
a movie.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I haven't seen it for a fair while. I'd say this is one that you've seen more than me. It's something that I
Yeah.
certainly came to a lot later on than I think most people our age. But why did you pick this movie?
I'll go into explaining why I picked this movie, but let's knock out the facts and the synopsis
I
out of the
don't
way.
want to. I want to do it differently. No, fair enough. We'll do the facts.
No.
We'll do the synopsis. So
How dare
away
you rebel against the Federation and the way things are done?
Yeah, I see why you like it now. I see. Look, I'm going to leave it with you because they are both your tasks this week. So enjoy
Yeah.
them.
In a future where Earth is united under a militaristic regime known as the Federation, humanity faces a relentless threat from the Arachnids, a brutal alien species. High school student Johnny Rico enlists in the Mobile Infantry, eager to serve alongside his friends, including the ambitious Dizzy and the charismatic Ace. After a devastating attack by the Arachnids on Buenos Aires, the Federation escalates its military response, sending troops to combat the alien menace in distant planets. Rico, his squad, they all undergo intense training, transforming into soldiers ready to face the horrors of war. As they engage in fierce battles against swarms of deadly arachnids, the cost of the conflict becomes starkly apparent. With personal losses affecting morale, amidst the chaos, they confront the chilling truths behind their government's propaganda and the nature of their enemy. In a climactic showdown, Rico and his comrades undertake a daring mission to capture the arachnid brain bug. Embodying the spirit of sacrifice and courage, the film concludes with a hard-won victory, leaving the soldiers to reflect on the price of heroism, the ongoing struggle for humanity's survival, and the propaganda that will propel them into the future. Released in 1997, directed by Paul Verhoeven, RoboCop, Total Recall, and one of the worst movies of all time, Showgirls. Screenplay by Edward Newmare. RoboCop, 1987, RoboCop, 2014, and this movie are pretty much his only features. Starring Casper Van Dien, Dina Meyer, Denise Richards, Jake Busey, Neil Patrick Harris, Patrick Muldoon, and at this point, friend of the podcast, Michael Ironside. Budget 100 to 110 million. Box office domestic in the US 121 million. The reason I picked this movie is there is a dichotomy between the people who watch it. Some people watch this movie, as I did as a teen, for the raunch and the action and the guns and the violence. And some people who get this movie understand the satire and how it's probably even more relevant today than it has been in 20 years. This movie, for anyone who has watched it and didn't get it, is making fun of the jingoistic, nationalistic, military complex. And I think it does it in a really kind of interesting way, both format-wise, story-wise, and character-wise. That is why I chose this movie.
Yeah, and that's the topic of conversation, isn't it, with Starship Troopers when you look at it. And I do want to address that because there is a lot of debate. There remains a lot of debate as to how well done the satire is or isn't done in this movie. And that's something that even on this latest rewatch, I also have questions about and thoughts about because what they have functionally done here with Starship Troopers is they have actually presented a perfect fascist society that is under total militaristic rule. And usually, when you satirize something, there is a huge tone of comedy through the entire proceeding. And what makes Starship Troopers unusual in that regard is there's really more a flavor of comedy that gets introduced here and there. It's more of a sprinkling. So it's much more difficult to look at this as satirical from start to finish. And it is fairly easy to actually do a read of the film where you're like, Well, are we just saying fascism's great? Because that is what the main characters seem to believe. And ultimately, that is what wins the day for them in the film.
So I agree with you. It's not an arrow through the heart of satire and fascism, but the satire comes in kind of in the pieces around the main action, like when you see reporters, when you see the ads for the military in between, when you see like the current dictator get ousted and just stand behind the new one. Like there's this kind of it's more about the machinery that runs the society that the satire sits in, not with the characters. Because you're right, in a movie like this, normally you'd have a rebellion or you'd have people who were anti the government or something like that. But for all intensive purposes, this society works very, very well. It doesn't present it as a failed thing that they're hiding under propaganda. It hides it under a very successful machine that they use propaganda just to keep pushing people forward to where they want them to go. Um, the people who wrote this, it's kind of an interesting path to this movie. So the team behind RoboCop, Paul Verhoeven, and all that sort of stuff, the writing team wanted to make another movie, and they struggled for a very long time, and they eventually broke up. And Edward Newmer kept going, and eventually started writing kind of like it was like Outpost 7, I think, is what his script was called.
I think it was
And it was
Bug
about
Hunted
this,
Outpost 7, I think is
yeah,
what it's
and it was
called.
about
Yeah.
this kind of like fascist government fighting aliens, all this sort of stuff. And when it kind of came to put it together, someone's like, hey, man, that's a lot like a thing that already exists, which was a book called Starship Troopers, and there's an epitaph or bit at the end of it. But they didn't think they could get the rights to it. So they kept kind of writing it, and then eventually they could get the rights to it. So they kind of transposed the book over top of like the set pieces that he'd written and all those sort of things. The book itself is not satire. The book treats the subject matter insanely seriously and is more of a treatise on the author's opinions on what the military complex should be. Like he's proper into it. Whereas
I don't know if I would agree there, because I know a bit about the author. I've read a couple. I haven't read Starship Troopers. I'll admit to that. I have not read the novel, but I've read a couple of Robert Heinlein's books, who is the author of Starship Troopers, and he is a fairly controversial figure anyway, because his politics shifted a couple of times during his lifetime, and to the point where it's unclear how he actually felt about a lot of these things, and as to what his ultimate purpose was. It seems like there's a read on Robert Heinlein to say he was perhaps a little bit like Philip K. Dick, perhaps, in being interested in different styles of government. I'm not sure if he was necessarily a fan of, fascist
I was more
dictatorships.
saying that the book treats it seriously. I didn't really mean to imply that that's what he thought was right or wrong.
Oh, I
People
see.
actually
I
described
see.
him as a bit more of a philosopher. Like he liked exploring ideas, whether they were right to explore or not. He like you said, he seems to have shifted political ideologies over the years, and it's mainly because the dude was just exploring stuff through his works.
Yeah.
I may have phrased it originally quite poorly. All I meant was the subject matter itself took itself seriously.
Yeah, fair enough. And yeah, that's what I've heard as well. Having not read the book, but that is certainly what I've heard about it. But like, it is an interesting film, and it's an interesting film because I think that when you put all of that together, you end up with something that is, in my opinion, fairly hollow,
Oh yeah,
and it's a very cardboard sort of thin story. And really, we follow this group through from high school to boot camp to training to combat, and by the end of the film they're veterans, but we really don't get a window outside into where the bugs or the arachnids came from, or what they want, or even really too much of a glimpse as to what human society is at this point in time. We're very isolated to this core group and their experiences. which by the end of the film, they've experienced tragedy, but the surviving characters are almost more hollow than they were emotionally at the beginning of the film, which is, I think, perhaps besides the political undercurrents, I actually think that is perhaps the reason this movie didn't hit with audiences at the time. Is it's hard to get on board with a character set who are progressively becoming less emotionally invested
Becoming
in one
monsters.
another, as the
Yeah.
film progresses. And then by the end, we've really got these soldiers who are battle hardened, but fairly unemotional, which is difficult for an audience to relate to. And I think that audiences leaving the theater probably weren't leaving it going, I feel great. They were leaving it going, I don't know if I like those guys and I don't know what's going on. And I think I'm just going to go watch James Bond.
Boo, James Bond. I honestly think, I can't be sure, I haven't read on it. I feel like that was fairly deliberate as far as the portrayal of the characters. Like, Paul Verhoeven is a guy who likes to make points. And you're right, throughout the film, that he does, the main character, Rico, right? He goes from somebody who is a dumb teenager to somebody who thinks he is responsible and in charge, and then realizes he's not. He has that tragedy on the training ground, and he's going to quit, and the emotions are too much, and all that sort of stuff. And then he gets into battle, proper battle. And after that first battle is where it changes. He experiences loss in a very brash way. It's not subtle. And you see that kind of that transition from to a hollow machine, a hollow monster, if you will, someone who is just about killing bugs. And he doesn't care why he kills bugs. He is all about it. Like, and that becomes the same with all the characters. Like, Jake Busey's character of Ace is literally the same note all the way through the movie. He goes, I joined the army to kill bugs. I kill bugs. That's all I want to do, kill bugs. The only characters that have a little bit of kind of weirdness or growth or change to them are the two female lead characters in a way. Like, the Denise Richards' character is an odd one in that she it's weird in a movie like this and of the age. She has her own agency. Like, she's someone who has a goal at the start, sets out to achieve that goal, separate of a love interest, and then achieves her goal. Like, that's odd in this movie.
Yeah, she's an interesting character because, I can't remember her character's name, which is awful, but the Denise Richards character in this film, it's difficult at the start because it's a very classic trope, and it's a trope for a reason. It's because it happens all the time, where you have a high school romance where one of the two people is far more invested in the relationship than the other one. And functionally, that the writing's on the wall for that relationship, and yet that is where our characters begin. And in a way, it's sort of, she doesn't change. She's not that interested in him at the start of the movie. She's not that interested in him halfway through the movie. She gets pursued by someone else in her, her pilot program, I suppose, when she's on the spaceship, and
who she's not that interested in.
She's not that interested in him either. She's interested in being a pilot and, having some friendships. And that is functionally her character right the way through the movie. And what is sad for, Casper Van Dien's character is he starts off head over heels in love and emotionally invested with this girl. And then in the final scene where they are reunited, he's so hollow by that point in time where he's basically like, hey, we're going to go kill some bugs together. Cool. We knew each other once, like that's the extent of the relationship, which is really what I was talking about before when I was saying it's unusual to take someone from a place of strong emotion to a place of complete, detachment, and then end your movie. The movie's done at that point. It's a reverse arc for the main character.
It's a really sad movie. Like, Like, you look at even the bit characters throughout the movie, like, why they're joining to be citizens. Like, I want to go into politics. I want to have children, and you need a license to have children in this world. And these are, on average, normal people who have to go through this experience to do it, and they're never going to get that to that next bit. It's just not going to happen. They're either going to die, or they're going to change in a way that they no longer want to do that other thing. It's a really kind of stark and bleak thing that is wrapped up in this kind of propaganda of this world. Like, the movie itself is pretty shiny until they're in combat. Like, when they're in high school, and the depictions of like the society around their world, like, they live a rich life. Like, they live a full life that they could have continued living, but they bought into the hype of the being a citizen.
Yeah, and it is interesting. You brought up the fact that this is a shiny world. So that almost gives me an angle to transition into something else I want to talk about, which is the idea of production design in this movie. Because this movie was 1997, but it feels like 1985 when you
Yeah.
actually look at it. It's
Yeah.
really, everything's blocky in, and there's not a lot of detail, quite deliberately. The architecture almost reminds me of, I guess, what you call like German brutalist architecture, where there's lots of concrete and there's lots of lines, and everything's very strong and very blocky. And it's funny that we know it came out in 1997, and it looks like it's 10 to 12 years older than that, until you see computer generated effects, at which point you lock yourself into the late 90s at that point in time. So, but I do find that is quite interesting. And the other thing, just a weird bit of Hollywood lore that I don't know if you know. If you do, forgive me, but
I'm excited.
The Starship Troopers armor is kind of famous because
I think I do know this, but go.
It's not one production. Here's the thing: because Starship Troopers was a flop at the time, and they had all of these suits of armor as a way to basically offset the flop of the movie, they would hire out their Starship Troopers armor to random other science fiction productions over the next sort of decade. And you can just see it. If you look at low budget sci-fi in particular from the next decade, I mean, the most famous example is probably Firefly, where it shows up in Joss Whedon's Firefly in that series. But literally, like, it's everywhere. And it's just like, hey, that's the Starship Troopers armor. It's some dudes in the background, always like looking vaguely military. And it's like, because they just had so much of it.
Those helmets just stand out.
Very distinctive. So, but that's a fun bit of Hollywood lore, I reckon. But the other thing that is sort of a behind the scenes fact, I guess, or point of interest, is that this was a major production for Phil Tippett Studios. So are you familiar with Phil Tippett?
Is he the stop motion-y dude?
Yes. So Phil Tippett was the stop motion genius from the 80s, really, working on Star Wars, and, then heavily involved in the pre-production of Jurassic Park and this sort of thing. And
RoboCop.
Exactly, RoboCop. And he was this pioneer of visual effects, and really there on the transition from traditional visual effects like stop motion and go motion to computer generated effects. And it was kind of an amazing success story because his studio, which did stop motion through the 90s, transitioned to the digital age, and his Phil Tippett Studios became a visual effects studio, and it was Starship Troopers that really was their testing ground. They did the bugs or the arachnids for Starship Troopers, and this movie is huge from a visual effects standpoint for 1997. There's hundreds of thousands of CGI arachnid bugs swarming over things. And when you look at the visual effects and you say, oh, that's not ILM, that is not the major visual effects house. That's this other effects house. And this was kind of their first major project. It's a really cool behind the scenes Hollywood success story. Unfortunately, Phil Tippett Studios actually closed finally in, I think it was this year, 2024, but there was a great documentary on his life and works, which you can look at if you want to. But yeah, Starship Troopers was the proving ground for his little studio, which was just getting off the ground.
It was. I actually think the visual effects were most impressive when there were more arachnids on the screens. Like, because you're looking at that and you're like, oh, this was 1997, and yeah, they cheat because they make the bugs all move together in parts and that sort of stuff. But that works for the bugs because they work in unison and they attack in unison. And I thought it was much more impressive now looking at it probably than when I first watched it and thought, oh, that looks silly or whatever.
Well, also
like,
because
that's a lot of work. That's so much work.
and you consider as well that we're still about 4 or 5 years off major crowd simulations that would actually have the computer govern this stuff. So when people
Was
were
that with
doing
like Massive?
Exactly, yeah, with Lord of the Rings and these sorts of projects. But we're pre that. We're looking at writing software to actually work with these characters or just keyframe painstakingly animating it frame by frame for all of the hundreds of different bugs on the screen. So there's a lot of work here and it's good work, particularly for 1997. Like it looks dated certainly, but again, I don't think it looks bad, so I think it's really something worth celebrating.
Well, I mean, even on top of that, the close up when they're fighting a single bug and it's like practical with the mix, it looks pretty cool. Like it looks not as well thought out just because of the design of some of the bugs. Like you're like, okay, it looks a little plasticky or it looks a little too shiny here or there. But again, impressive visuals for the time and even interesting, super interesting now. The last thing I kind of want to bring up is this movie has probably some of the worst received sequels of any movie I've ever seen in my life. I've never seen them, by the way, but this was like the era of the direct to VHS or the direct to DVD sequel. Like Starship Troopers 2 and 3 were direct to home video, basically. And there were the massive drop in budget. And they were really just playing off the cult nature of the original film. But it actually makes me think that this movie is one of those few candidates for a remake. Like, you could remake this movie in modern day with modern graphics for not as much as I think you'd have to make it, because you could actually make it a more self-contained story or things like that. You don't have to do massive bug invasions. That's been done, right? What do you think of the possibility of a remake for this film? I actually have no idea if it's on the cards in any way, but
no, I think you're right. I think it's the perfect time right now to be remaking Starship Troopers. And I think you'd certainly change some things about the story and the way it's constructed from the original. But I absolutely agree with you that this is perfect for remake territory. So, and it's interesting that you talk about the sequels because we talked about the idea that this was a flop, but it was a flop when it first came out. And then it had one of those crazy slow growth over time situations, which then led to the ability to make these sequels for
home
the
video
low budget.
made this movie.
Yeah. And, it's interesting. I actually, listened to a long form interview with, Casper Van Dien about this movie just this year. I think it was Michael Rosenbaum's podcast, Inside of You with,
don't promote other people's podcasts. I'm joking.
Well, it was great. And he talks about Starship Troopers and it's that thing of he didn't know that he was going to be associated with this film for the rest of his life functionally and the rest of his career, because he's gone on to do plenty of other stuff, but he was a very young actor at that time. And of course, when the movie comes out and it's a flop, at the time it's like, oh, well, that's over. No one will ever remember that. I'm finished. And then it had that slow, weird growth about a few years after it came out and people finding it on VHS, finding it on DVD, and suddenly people just know him from Starship Troopers. And he talks about that bizarre phenomenon of the thing that he thought would tank his career because it was so poorly received at the time still is the thing that people know him for today and are actually celebrating with him. And he's talking about the idea that military troops and people in the army will watch Starship Troopers and then, send him fan mail and things like that. And I'm like, so this movie has a long tail, even though it looked like it wasn't going anywhere at the time it came out. It just had this crazy long tail of success after the fact. So, which is always interesting.
Super interesting. Well, I mean,
The way you said
that's
super
what.
interesting made me
No,
think not interesting.
yeah, it's been what 30 odd podcasts now. I don't find you interesting at all. I can't keep doing this. This is the end. No, it is super interesting. What I was trying to
color bars on the screen, cut to black. We're done.
This is the end of a friendship.
It's the end of the friendship. It's the end of the channel. It's over.
I can't keep pretending, man.
No.
What I was going to say is that's kind of why I find this movie so interesting. There's so much about this movie which means it shouldn't be successful. It shouldn't be remembered. It should be looked at as like, wow, that was all right, whatever. But this movie is something that is more a sum of more than its parts because people latched onto it. People dug into it. People found meaning. People watch it because it's gory. People watch it because they like the ideas. People watch it because they like the satire. It's a piece of art that can be viewed in multiple different directions from multiple different people and have multiple different things get out of it. And each one of them would probably say, hey, man, not a brilliant movie, but hey, that's interesting. Or hey, that's cool.
It also speaks to Paul Verhoeven as a director. This is the third Paul Verhoeven movie we've actually looked at and analyzed on this podcast. And he has a certain quality and a certain philosophy to his movies when he makes them, because he makes a highly commercial product, but he packs it full of political ideas and social commentaries as well. And it means that you can never really discount a Paul Verhoeven film because they may not be successful at the time, and a lot of them aren't, but he does things in an unusual way and in a way that is not the same as many other sort of journeyman directors. And you can't discount that. That counts for something in the movie landscape, having that unique voice and unique take and being able to walk that line between something incredibly odd and something highly commercial and trying to weave those two things together. And he does it really well in this one yet again. And this is sort of the last big Paul Verhoeven movie that we got. He functionally, and I suppose, again, that's more of a sad part of the story, I guess, after the commercial failure of Starship Troopers, he really did go away as sort of a big budget director. Particularly
just before this was Showgirls, which tanked.
Well, I was just about to say it's a 1-2 hit of Showgirls and then Starship Troopers, and then that was enough at that time to say, oh, we're done. We're done with the Paul Verhoeven business for a while. So,
I mean, what you were saying before, the movies we've watched of his, and the movies I've seen previous of his, a lot of movies are made for the time. Like, hey, this is a snapshot of the time. This is what we're thinking. This is what we're doing. These movies are that as well. But there's a quality to them that makes them rewatchable because they reflect differently depending on the time you've watched them. The ideas we might not longer politically agree with, or the comments we might not agree with, or they might just be more relevant than ever just because of the way history marches forward. And that's kind of a weird thing in anything other than like really high quality or art house cinema, that we're getting in kind of this kind of lower budget mid-tier sci-fi. And I think, you've solidified it for me. That's why I find these movies interesting, because they've always got something to say, and sometimes it's new for you, even if the subject matter is the exact same.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for taking us on the Starship Troopers journey. Would you like to hear where the journey is going to continue?
Starship Troopers 2. Starship Troopers 2.
No, we're not 3. We're not doing that. I have been racking my brain for where we should go next, because what I realized, I was looking back through all of our different casts and all of our different movies and our sensibilities, and occasionally you'll see this in our history of doing this podcast. I like to just shake it up sometimes and just do something that's just a little different. And what I realized was
This rarely goes well for me.
we haven't really gone into recent cinema.
Ooh.
We don't tend to. We're old, Ben, is what I'm feeling. I'm feeling
We are
old.
old.
You know, I look at this vodcast, as I will continue to call it until the day I die, and I look at our gray hair and our beards. We're old men talking about old movies. And I went, you know what? I would love to say I've got a recent movie to engage with the youth, but I've got a recent movie that is not at all going to engage the youth.
I got a recent old man movie.
I got a recent old man movie for you. But look, without any further ado, and I hope you haven't seen this. One of the reasons was I really want to get your take on it, but we're going to look at a little movie from the 2020s called The Green Knight with Dev Patel.
I have seen this.
Oh, okay.
But I don't think I really paid attention.
Yes, okay. That's fair. The Green Knight is highly unusual. Technically it's an Arthurian movie, the idea of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and based on the Green Knight legend, which is part of that mythos. But I won't spoil it. I think it's great. So
I don't remember it at all. So
okay. There's a couple of versions of it. We're looking at the version directed by David Lowery and starring Dev Patel. And that's what we're going to look at next week. We're going to go from the distant future to the far mythological past. And we're going to go from spaceships to swords. And we're going to look at the Green Knight. And I think it's going to be a wild ride in its own way. So I look forward to that. And I hope that you enjoy diving back in to look at this Arthurian legend. But until that time, why don't you tell the good people of the world where they can find our magical podcast?
Hey guys. We've been speaking to you. You've been listening. Well, some of you have been listening. So hey, let's do the podcast a solid. I'm looking straight at you. You know who you are. I want you to subscribe. I want you to like, and I want you to leave a comment. You know why? Because we're friends now. We've watched movies together. We've talked about movies together. We've disagreed. We'd agreed. So if you'd like to like, subscribe, and comment, you can do that in multiple places. You can do that on our YouTube channel, Jim and Ben's Movie Adventures. You can do that on our iTunes or our Spotify, Jim and Ben's Movie Adventures. Hey, you can also head over to our Instagram, Jim_and_Ben, and you can see short clips. You can see thumbnails. You can see movie posters. You can see movies before we release them. You can see all that awesome stuff. But that is contingent. The social contract here is that you like, you comment, and you subscribe. Thank you so much for listening to our podcast. This has been Jim and Ben's Movie Adventures. We've inflicted films on each other and you. I hope you come back next week.
I feel like that final read there was really channeling that fascist dictatorship, saying they must subscribe.
They must.
You know?
Guys, guess what? Do your part. Do your part. Like, comment, and subscribe. It's what Johnny would want.
On that
Carmen
note,
would want.
We can't stay here any longer. Jim out.
I'm staying here till they like, comment, and subscribe.
Bye.
See you guys.